So when we talk about hypersonics, we mentioned there's a few things that are going to change. So first off, we have this very, very, very close shockwave to the surface, and it gets so close that it's actually starting to interfere, or actually interact, I should say, with the boundary layer. That section right next to the surface, where we have our flow go from being completely stopped to being at our free stream velocity. And that boundary layer interaction actually changes the shape of the shockwave, so it's no longer going to be perfectly straight. It's going to curve along with the boundary layer, which is inside of it. Okay, but while we've mentioned boundary layers, we've kind of basically talked about what they are. We haven't done too much with them. We've kind of just said, they're at the surface, they're small, we're going to ignore them, but they're necessary for everything, otherwise we can't fly. So that changes today. Today we finally get to talk about Chapter 17, which is Introduction to Boundary Layers. It's going to be glorious, or it's going to go terribly. We'll find out what happens. Okay. Now, as a note, boundary layers can have its own entire course. So with that being said, just realize that we're going to be giving a good foundation here, but not jumping into the depths of it. Okay, not jumping into the depths of it. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about this super thin area where skin friction comes from, where the majority of our friction comes from, where our drag comes from, this tiny, tiny area, and go from there. Now, if we're going to look at the boundary layer, let's see here. First off, let's go ahead and get our setup. So, introducing it, just did that. But after that, we're going to kind of split off. So on one side, we will eventually start developing our boundary layer equations. And then on the other side, we're going to figure out how the properties change inside this boundary layer. So boundary layer properties, and I'm talking about pressure, temperature, all of that. How does that change inside of this? And there's a lot more down here. So, we're not going to just talk about the properties. We're also going to be talking about things like the thickness. What is the thickness of the boundary layer? That's going to matter. How much does it displace the flow? And also, laminar versus turbulent, how does that work? Okay, so with that being said, let's jump right into the boundary layer properties. And to do that, I want to go ahead and give you my basic picture here. So we're going to use a flat plate, infinitely thin flat plate, as always. I'm so glad that we have these just sitting around everywhere. It makes it a lot easier for all of our calculations. And so with this infinitely thin flat plate, I'm going to draw our regular shape for the boundary layer. I'm also going to draw this dotted line right here, which I'm going to explain in just a second. Now, the first thing that might shock you is that you have multiple different boundary layers. Oh, multiple different boundary layers. So, what's going to surprise you is that we actually have multiple boundary layers. We have the first one that we're used to. This is our velocity boundary layer. And that right there is my velocity profile. It's just simply showing how it goes from 0 at the surface up to some sort of free stream velocity at the edge. But then I will also have a temperature profile. So I'm going to draw that out here. And it goes something like this. It's a max kind of in the middle of my boundary layer, my velocity boundary layer, and then it drops down at the surface to the wall temperature. Okay. So this is temperature. This one right here is velocity. And I'll put these little lines here, though it's not moving in that direction, obviously, it's just temperature. Perfect. Now, other things. I have a thickness. So that thickness right here is delta. And I have a second thickness right here. That is delta with a subscript T. That's the thickness of my temperature boundary layer. And so this one right here is my thermal boundary. And this one right here is my velocity boundary. like I said, that's where you get to t is equal to t edge, or u is equal to u at the edge. Okay, now a result of this, which is pretty obvious, is if we have a velocity gradient, we already know it's going to cause a shear stress, because when we look at my shear stress equation, shear stress at the wall is equal to the viscosity times du dy at the wall. And you're like, well, viscosity is 0. Well, it was, but we're now in a viscous region. Okay, this is a viscous region. No longer can we say that it is inviscid. So mu is not equal to 0 here. I have to take that into account. And in a similar way, that temperature profile will also cause heat transfer. So just like there's a shear stress at the wall, there would also be heat being transferred. Once again, based on this time the temperature gradient, while before it was the velocity gradient. And that was some wonderful handwriting there. So let's go ahead and get that fixed. There we go. Okay, so we have both of these. And these begin to tell us why we have to care about this surface. Because, well, heat transfer rate is simply saying how much heat am I absorbing eventually. That's where I get that from. And this guy right here is going to go to my skin friction drag. Not pressure drag, but skin friction drag. And if you remember from our last chapter, what we learned is that if I have a body that's a very, very sharp body, then my skin friction drag is actually a much higher proportion of the overall drag. So pressure drag, or wave drag, what we would call it, is going to be a much smaller proportion for these very, very slender bodies. However, conversely, if I am, a very broad shape, like a reentry vehicle, then the drag due to skin friction is much, much less than the drag due to the pressure, and so boundary layer is much less important, at least when it comes to drag in that case. In both cases, though, I have to care about this guy. I need to care about heat transfer, because otherwise people are going to cook. We don't want that. Okay, so this is just our start here. We're getting this idea of how a boundary layer looks. And you deal with these boundary layers all the time. You don't realize you're dealing with them, but you do. Like, for example, the thermal boundary layer is the reason that you feel cold and when you're in a pool and you start walking around. So when you're in a pool, here you are, sitting in a pool, okay. While you're in this pool, you are radiating heat out. And so there is some sort of temperature profile going away from you. If you stay still and the water is still, you will develop eventually. Here's a graph for like distance from your body and temperature, T, and let's see here, just call that distance. You're going to have some sort of temperature profile, which goes kind of like this, drops down. So that tells you why you feel cold or not, because as long as that temperature profile does not change, the Q dot is constant. The amount of heat that's leaving your body is the same, and if you're comfortable, you're comfortable. As soon as you move, though, what you will see is that you are actually going to start squishing that profile. So the temperature profile goes from being like that when you're still to being much, much thinner as soon as you start moving. And since my del T del Y is now much higher, call this 2, that means my heat transfer rate 2 is going to be more than my heat transfer rate 1. And so you feel cold. Once again, with an absolutely beautiful thing. Boundary layers, you don't quite see as much. They're still incredibly, velocity boundary layers. You have to be very careful this semester. You don't see quite as much, but they still have a huge effect on our lives. Okay, let's stop there, and then we'll jump into some more properties we need to care about for boundary layers.